Thank you for joining Spectator TV. Debbie, this week you write about the Scottish Government's planned ban on conversion therapy and how it is perhaps more sinister than it first seems on paper. Can you tell us more?
Well, you've got to ask why the Scottish Government is so keen on pushing this legislation and pushing it now. If you read through the consultation, their own consultation, it's clear that there is little need for any new laws. Coercive and abusive practices are already illegal, and they struggle to actually find any examples of where this law will actually catch things that the other law wouldn't. So you've got to ask why they're doing it, and the concern the whole time is that it will criminalise normal exploratory therapy, so that therapists cannot challenge patients on what they say about themselves. And most worryingly of all, in my view, when children are involved, therapists may be in a position where they're unable to do anything apart from blindly affirm what the child tells them.
Yes, and Debbie, in your article, you give an example of potentially someone going round to speak to a friend who's thinking about transitioning and how they could fall foul of this. Can you talk us through the example you offer?
Well, it's just not clear what is going to be criminalised and what is not. The consultation talks about safeguards, but we're talking about pushing the criminality further than what it is at the moment. So at the moment, it's a criminal offence to try to change somebody's sexual orientation if you mean them harm, and that should surely be enough. So to push that further suggests to me that the Scottish Government is looking at those normal conversations where people don't mean anybody any harm. They just want to try and help.
Michael, can you talk us through the practical implications of what's being proposed?
So the proposal that they have here is quite extensive. There's a lot that they're trying to do, and simultaneously there's a lot that they're expressly saying that they're not trying to do. So Debbie has mentioned that there's a lot of this that's already covered by existing criminal laws. There's a lot of things that we would ordinarily understand when we think of the phrase kind of conversion therapy that would just be already covered under the law relating to assault or kind of anything that relates to kind of a physical attack on an individual. So what they're trying to capture here is talking to people and trying to convince people in the process of talking with them to change or to suppress their sexual orientation or their gender identity or their own perception of their sexual orientation or their gender identity. But there's a carve out in the proposal to ensure that if you're engaging this from the perspective of a healthcare provider, that's not going to be captured by the proposal. So it seems like the only people who are actually going to be captured by this proposal, the most likely people are going to be people like family members or friends of individuals who are talking to them and are going beyond what you would ordinarily kind of describe as just kind of exploring someone's identity. But for example, let's say you have a mother of a teenager, and the teenager is a biological female who has in the past expressed same-sex attraction and is now identifying as a boy. Now, if the parent had responded to that child and said, "No, you're not a heterosexual boy. You're probably dealing with some kind of internalized homophobia. You likely are just a lesbian, and we love you, and we are happy to affirm that." Well, that could become a criminal offence now, because what's happening there is that the parent is purposely trying to engage in a conversation that is challenging the individual's self-assessment of their own identity. That's the most likely thing to be practically captured by this. Now, realistically, it's unclear whether or not these are the kind of things that are going to result in the police getting involved necessarily, but the bill also includes provision for protective orders that would allow third parties, potentially even campaigning organisations, so long as they can demonstrate a connection to the family, to be able to seek a court order to interfere in the relationship between the parent and child in that context. So practically speaking, what we're more likely to see here is something that we've seen in other areas of law around this area, which is that the legislation is relatively tightly drafted and is intended to capture a very small sliver of protectional forms of conduct. And then it's then represented outside of the legislative legal framework in kind of society and in advocacy organisations as something much more broadly encompassing than it actually is, which will then create a chilling effect, or will create this kind of practical problem that causes people to modify their behaviour, even if what they would have been doing in the past is not this new criminal offence. So there's a real danger that people talking to their family members or their friends and expressing views like, I don't think it's possible to change biological sex, people might think that that's being captured by this bill when in fact it's not. The bill specifically has a carve out for that as well. So there's a lot of carve outs in this bill or this proposal that will, it shows that the Scottish Government has been thinking about the implications of this for potential legal challenges that they might be facing. And so the actual thing that, as Debbie says, that the bill is trying to do is extremely narrow, but the rhetoric around it and the discussion around it might make it seem to be much more broader than it actually is. And the narrow thing that it's doing is itself open to challenge from people who are of the viewpoint that you shouldn't be criminalising those kinds of discussions between friends and family members, for example.
Yes, Debbie, in Westminster, there's been talk in the past about these conversion therapy bans, but often it's just been seen as too complicated in terms of legislation, in terms of unintended consequences, enacting it. Do you think the SNP government thinks it's found a perfect solution, or do you think something else is driving it in terms of why they're so focused on this, particularly after the Gender Recognition Act?
Well, you'd think after they got into so much hot water over the Gender Recognition Reform Bill that they would leave this well alone. But once again, it seems to the SNP government trying to work, I would say, outside their remit. Even in these proposals, it talks about provisions made for somebody who is removed from Scotland. So you can have a situation where a conversation is perfectly legal in England, but because somebody is habitually resident in Scotland, and they're taken to England for that conversation, it can then be illegal in Scotland. That could become a criminal offence under these proposals. And it just seems to me, once again, it's that the SNP government is trying to legislate outside what is their remit of a devolved authority.
Yeah, Michael, how do you think that will work? Because obviously we've previously seen the SNP government fail when it came to their, as Debbie's mentioning, their last big gender recognition policy, and it was challenged by the UK government successfully. Is this going to create any issues like that in the sense of how it works across, over to England and to Scotland?
I think there's less of a risk of that with this bill, partially because the Scotland Act actually has a number of instances where we've seen legislation that is that looks like it might have a cross-border implication, but actually doesn't. So a classic example of this might be taxing people on property that they own in Scotland, or taxing people who are resident on property that they own outside of Scotland. That's been that would be kind of understood pretty clearly as being within the competency of the Scottish Parliament to be able to legislate on. The issue here is kind of twofold, and it's more related to things like human rights. So things like the freedom of expression, freedom of religion, freedom of belief. And there's an assessment in this proposal that says that they've considered the impact that this proposed legislation would have on the ability of people to express their religious beliefs or to engage in religious practices or philosophical beliefs. We know that gender-critical feminism is a protected philosophical belief as well. And the Scottish Government has said that they don't think there's going to be a significant impact on the enjoyment of the rights that people have. And if you look specifically or strictly at the bill itself, there's or the proposals that they have narrowly tailored this to ensure that it's only going to be affecting a small sliver of conduct. But there could still potentially be human rights challenges that occur here. And those challenges that the Scottish Parliament is not empowered to breach international human rights obligations under the European Convention of Human Rights. And so you could potentially see challenges here as well. And you could also see challenges in terms of how the proposals are implemented. So it's one thing if on the books it says that they're not going to be using this to criminalise people expressing their lawfully held views, or they're not going to use it to criminalise therapists engaging in exploratory therapy with patients. But if in practice that's what the police end up doing, if in practice you end up getting a call from a police officer that says, look, you've not actually breached the law, but you're in real danger of doing so, and I want to warn you, and I'm going to record this as a hate incident. And we've seen this kind of examples happening in the past. Scotland is in a different situation to the United Kingdom as a whole, because Scotland's constitutional framework places very express limits on the legislative capacity of Scotland. I don't think that this bill will be out with the capacity of the Scottish Parliament, but its implementation might run into human rights challenges.
And Debbie, finally, what do you think, is there a chance this doesn't become law? We've seen in the past, when it comes to the SNP ranks, Kate Forbes, Ash Reagan have been questioning of Humza Yousaf and the Green Party and some of the direction here. Could we see a bit of pushback potentially?
Well, politically, it's very interesting, and it's the basis of the government in Scotland. How much of this is being driven by the Greens, by the Scottish Greens, and how much by the SNP itself is not certain. And as the general election approaches, the SNP must be looking at their knocking on doors and thinking about their voters and realising that this sort of legislation is not what the voters are looking for. There's far more pressing concerns. The people of Scotland have got far more pressing concerns than what Michael has described as very, very narrow legislation that will pick up very little.
Thank you, Debbie. Thank you, Michael.